Okay, so in honor of Chanukah, I want to talk about a Chanukah inyan, something that at a previous time in Klal Yisrael's history was very prevalent minig, something that had a lot of impact, but something that over time has dissipated to the point where most people don't even know of its existence. But it's played a central role in telling the story of Chanukah throughout the Deiros. And what I'm talking about is a book called Megillas Antiochos, which is kind of a Megillah similar to, let's say, Megillas Esther, that retells the entire story of the Nes Chashmiram and the Nes in the Beis HaMikdash in great detail, and with many of the Midrashim and the Chazals that we've been accustomed to, as children, growing up knowing the source material comes from there. And it's something that has permeated very deeply into the fabric of our consciousness, of the way Klal Yisrael remembers Chanukah. But the book itself is no longer read that often, certainly not in any formal fashion, in Beis Medrash during a tefillah, as we'll discuss, and practically not at all. So I wanted to talk about the Megillas Antiochos, how it came on the scene, when it burned brightest, and when it faded away. And I think that interesting nakuda to highlight is the tkufa, the specific tkufa during Klal Yisrael's history that it burned brightest. So let me just explain, a little bit of a roundabout way to get there. In 1957, the city of Tel Aviv had a book award that they would award to scholars who were putting out books that were masterpieces. And in 1957, they wanted to award the Praster of Cook. It was called the Praster of Cook from the area of Tel Aviv, to two outstanding scholars for their contributions to the literary world. One of them was someone by the name of Reb Shaul Lieberman. He was the Rosh Hashiva, if you'll call it, the head, the rector of the conservative yeshiva, the conservative theological school in New York. And he had published recently a book called Tosefta Kipshuta, which was explaining the Toseftas in a very clear way, comparing the Girsis. It was a monumental work in making the Tosefta more accessible for people to learn with. Ad Kedei Kach that even Rav Chatzkel Abramsky later on in Chazon Yecheskel, which is the Tosefta that many of us have seen, when he publishes his Tosefta over the years, after that, he certainly incorporates certain nakudas and certain elements of the Tosefta, that Tosefta Kipshuta from Rav Shaul Lieberman. Rav Shaul Lieberman was a cousin of the Chazon Ish, by all accounts a significant Talmud Chacham, but he was the Rosh Hashiva of the conservative movement in New York City. The second person who they wanted to award the Praster of Cook to at the same time was someone by the name of Reb Meshulam Roth. Reb Meshulam Roth had just put out his Chaylas Shuvah Sefer called Chaylas Shuvah's Kol Mevaser, Chelik Aleph. It was a substantial Chaylas Shuvah Sefer that had some very interesting, groundbreaking work, and he was an important Rav on the scene in the state at that time, and they wanted to award the award to these two rabbis together for their contributions to the literary world. Now, what happens is that Reb Meshulam Roth protests vociferously. He says he absolutely refuses to accept an award that's being awarded to him together with a conservative rabbi. He rather refers to him as a reform rabbi, but be that as it may, whatever the amount of difference that is, he insists that he's not going to accept this award together with this other rabbi, and he puts up a big fuss. Now, right away, what happens is different rabbanim, get on each side, and different shuvas are written, and different, bulletins are posted, and on different kavtzei etc. And it turns into kind of a big battle. Eventually, Reb Shaul Lieberman decides to take himself out of the running over here, and it says he's not going to take this award so as to avoid this fight. And Reb Meshulam Roth, I think, eventually accepts the award on his own, and that's how the story ends. But now the tshuvas part of it, in the sichsuch lahalacha that arose between the camp of Reb Meshulam Roth and the camp of Reb Shaul Lieberman, and the Kol Mevaser and Chelik Beis, Reb Meshulam Roth himself, and Kol Mevaser Chelik Beis, he himself in Tshuva Yud Zayin writes a tshuva about this, where the title of the tshuva is Al Dvar Hashayla Mutter L'Shamish B'Tor Meireh, in regards to the question if it's mutter to serve as a meireh, the Beis HaMedrash L'Rabbanim Reformim Zeis Tshuvasi, and then he posts, he writes a whole answer, he posits a whole response to that shayla. Now, one of the core, call it rayas, back and forth, that were used by the both sides. So Rishonim Roth in his tshuva, he brings, all the sugis, the Gemara and Sanhedrin, by teaching Torah to Talmud Sheni Hagun and the Shulchan Aruch and etc. And then, back and forth about who and when you're allowed to teach Torah to someone. But the main raya from a previous time in history that both of these, camps were bringing proofs is from the story of the Karaim. Now, the story of the Karaim is a fascinating story. Exactly at what point the Karai stream of religion, of Judaism starts, is a little bit unclear. There's different theories that date it to different times. There's different earlier figures that could be linked, in some sense or another to the Karai movement. But the basic premise of the Karai movement was that they only believe in the Torah Shebachsav, as it says in the Psukim. Torah Shebal Peh was not something they believed in, more or less similar to Tztukim and Baisusim and the likes. And therefore there were those who linked them up to those earlier streams of Jews, the Tztukim and Baisusim, and said that they were, a continuation. There were those who said they were newer, but the time that the Karam really came to shine is in the 800s. There was a big fight amongst two family members of the Reish Galusa. Now, in Iraq, this is in Iraq, in Bavel, in the 800s, during the Tkuf of the Nasiim, during I think it's the Abbasid Caliphate, they were living under the Muslims, but they were allowed to have a Reish Galusa, some sort of leader who led the Jews, who had, to a certain degree, had a lot of power. There's a famous, story about Bostanai, the first Reish Galusa of Bavel, and we won't talk about him today, but from the family of Bostanai, there was a fight amongst the family. There was a Reish Galusa, his name was Shlomo ben Chazdai, and when he dies, he leaves behind two children. One of them's name is Anon, he's the older one, and one of them's name is Chanina. And Anon and Chanina are both competing desperately to be the Reish Galusa. Now Anon, you'll see sometimes, is referred to as Anon ben David. That's just a reference to the fact that he came from the Davidic line. He came from David HaMelech's house, so he was, shayach to the king's house. But Anon ben Chazdai is his real name, and Anon ben David is how he's referred to. But Anon ben David desperately wanted to be the Reish Galusa. Now his brother Chanina was deemed to be more worthy of that position, for whatever reason it would be, and he got the Steller instead. Now Anon is enraged by this, and he does not want to abide with this outcome of having his brother Chanina be the Reish Galusa, so he proclaims himself to be a Reish Galusa as well. Now, under the laws at that time in Iraq, there was only allowed to be one Reish Galusa at a time for the Jews. So Anon is promptly arrested by the Caliph, and he's put into prison, and he's sentenced to death for the crime of fomenting revolution by having a second Reish Galusa. Now, by a stroke of good fortune or bad fortune, he meets a Muslim lawyer, like someone who goes on to be a very, very famous lawyer in the Muslim world. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but his name was Abu Hanifa or something to that effect. And he, being a Muslim lawyer who very much understood the legal system of the caliphate, he explains to Anon that there's a simple workaround over here. He says, listen, explain to the caliph as follows. He says, just like there's allowed to be a pope and a caliph and an imam and a Reish Galusa, because they all represent different religions, and therefore there's allowed to be, different leaders for different religions, just explain to the caliph that you're not Jewish. You're a different religion. You're a Karoi. And in order to make it very believable, so flesh out the exact religious beliefs that you believe Karoim are. And basically what they worked out is very simple. Whatever the rabbinic Jews, the Frumma Jews, held to be very important, he would poo-poo and say, no, that's not the thing, go only with the pasuk. And basically, he worked it down to a system of believing only in the things that are mafurish in the Torah, and ignoring everything that's at the Kanas Chachamim, and saying that the Chachamim, they invented a new brand of Judaism. Fakat, rabbinic Judaism is a new brand of Judaism, and me, based on the Torah, I'm the real Jews. The Karaim are the real Jews. Now, incidentally, although we maybe think that the Chachamim are machmer in a lot of things, Anon ended up having a tremendous amount of chumris on his followers also, because the Rabbanon also have a tremendous amount of kulis that are institutionalized, that are built in to our halacha. But Anon's followers took him for the kulis, for the chumris. Over time, I think, the observance dissipated and it became less relevant. But at the time, upon him, even though it involved taking on some chumris, this became the platform of the Karaim, that this is their religion. Now, in order to strengthen their battle with the Chachamim, and to say that the Chachamim's Havana of the Torah and the Chachamim's insertions and additions and all the Rabbanans are unacceptable and are illegitimate. What Anan and his people sought to claim is that the Chachamim invented certain myths and certain premises to prop up their koiches and to make people follow them. And really, it was all made up stuff, and really only what it says in the Torah is what you're supposed to follow. Now, one of the things that, strangely enough, Anon and his Hasidim, the Karaim, decided to attack is Chanukah, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I realized I'm skipping a step over here. So just to circle back to Meshulam Roth and the Shaul Lieberman. So there's a tshuva from the Re'im, from Rabbi Leo Mizrahi, where basically over later Deiris, before we talk about Chanukah, over later Deiris, as the Karaim separated themselves more and more from normative Jews and from normative halacha, so the shaila became how to look at them. Do you look at them as goyim? Do you look at them as yidden? Under what premise, what treatment do you give them? Now the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim in Parak Gimel Halacha Gimel, the Rambam writes lahedya that we say that a mummer, that someone who's a kaifer is maridim v'leimailin, you're supposed to try to get rid of him. That's only by someone who's the first generation, possibly the second generation of a kaifer, someone who's making big strides to be Eiker the Torah and to do stuff like that. So maridim v'leimailin. But the Rambam says clearly that the children and the grandchildren, the great grandchildren of the Karaim, it says Kemai elu hanimtzaim beinenu kayim. Those, he says, are rather the katinik shenishba. They don't deserve to be treated so harshly. Now, there's rather a steer to this. The Rambam in Shutta Rambam seems to say something different, and there's a flurry of tshuvas from many, many different poskim of the day. The Radvaz has a tshuva, the Mabit has a tshuva, and there's more that handle, various different questions about how to look at them in regards to yichus, in regards to psulei kahal, in regards to their status as Jews. That's lots of machlokes and back and forth in regards to the status of Karaim. And this shaila, some of them have persisted, up to relatively recently. There was large communities of Karaim in Egypt. There were large communities of Karaim in Ukraine and Lithuania. So these shailas, some of them have persisted, up until relatively recently. But one of the main shailas that was the nidin in regards to the Karaim was a shaila that was posed to Rabbi Leo Mizrahi, the Re'im, in Izmir in Turkey, in the 1400s, I believe it is, in the end of the 1400s in Izmir, where there's a large community of Karaim that is pretty much ignorant. And there's a large community of from Jews there who are well versed and well knowledge, have a lot of knowledge in many different Torah subjects. And the question was, are Jewish tutors and Jewish rebbeim allowed to teach Torah to these Karai children? Now, the question as it's phrased, as it's posed to the Re'im, there was a chayrim that the community put out. Some members of the community established a chayrim saying that no Jewish tutor is allowed to teach any subject to any Karai child, be it math, be it science, be it Torah, with no exception. And the idea behind it was, the rationale was to create clear lines of distinction so that there shouldn't be any blurring between these lines. Now came a group of disgruntled tutors to the Re'im and they said that, you're stealing our parnasa. By making such a law, by such a chayrim outlawing us from teaching anything to any of the Karai children, you're disallowing a very lucrative stream from our income, and then we won't abide that. We can't have that. Now the Re'im is a long tshuva. It's 20-something pages long, back and forth, debating the exact pratim, a lot of hilchas chayrim, a lot of the exact status of how you look at Karaim, back and forth on many, many details in regards to these Nakudas. But Teichad Dvarim, what arises from there is that the Re'im does allow for Jewish tutors, for frum tutors, to teach even Torah to Karai children. And the premise that the Re'im works under is that since these Karai children are Tinoi Nishba, they're not people who are with serious agenda or serious desire to uproot Klal Yisrael, to uproot the Torah. So as long as they make some sort of small commitment to not mock the Torah, to not mock the Chachamim, you're allowed to teach them. Now, the Re'im is he chazes it over several times in several different manners, and therefore there's room for every shita to have his opinion come from this Re'im. But B'chalif, the Re'im does allow the beginning, some sort of Pesach, for allowing from people to teach Torah even to Karam. Now, based on this is where the camp that was supporting Shaul Lieberman came and said that, listen, yeah, you're right that it's the conservative movement of America and that it's not leading to great things and etc. But Lamaisa, these are people who otherwise would have no access to Torah. And Shaul Lieberman, yes, this is not the circles he grew up in, and yes, he knows better. and he's not, joining their lifestyle. He himself is staying personally from. He's teaching them Torah and he's being samech on the re'im. And this back and forth, and the Kol Mavaser for his side, Rabbi Shalom Roth, in his Tshuva, he explains how clearly the re'im was talking about a very different case, where it's Tinoi Kishanishba, where it's, as opposed to these, where it's going to be future rabbis. These conservative rabbis are going to educate the next dar with the conservative vision. And at that time in the United States, especially in the 1950s, shuls were turning over from Orthodox to Reform to conservative at very high numbers. And this was a very, very large problem that Klal Yisrael was facing at the time. And to say that just because the Re'im allowed teaching Torah to Karayim who were barely Karayim anymore, who were maskim to Shtal Tzu, that's not a Tzu to this, and it's unacceptable, and therefore he refuses to accept the award, and the fight raged back and forth and back and forth. Now, that's all, the modern day application of the Karayim question. Now, on the Karayim question itself, one of the most interesting responses to the Karayim, aside from these different tshuvas that handle the status of the Karayim in regards to being kosher l'kahal, and in regards to their shchita and their yayin and teaching them Torah and etc., and how to look at them as tinik shenishba, not tinik shenishba. Besides all the halachas that we did, that these meishivim that we're not going into now in detail, that talk about in regards to Karayim, one of the most interesting aspects that brought forth a strong response to the Karayim was Chanukah. It seems that at a certain point during the Karayim's desire to establish themselves and to set aside what makes them Karayim versus what makes rabbinic Jews, was they said that the Chanukah, the story of Chanukah, the myth of Chanukah, with all that was included of it, they said that never happened. That was a premise that the Rabbanim used to reestablish a foothold, to make strong control, to make like this type of pride in standing up. Meaning the Chanukah story is full of pride for standing up for Torah and Avodah. It's not a story about physical salvation. It's a story of spiritual salvation. It's a story of where we were challenged, we were pushed to the wall, we were told we can't be religious anymore. We asked to, Kisva al Karen Ashara in the Chelik Balikei Yisrael, and Klal Yisrael pushed back and they said, no, it's worth it for us to fight and to stand for what's important to us. So the Karayim started alleging that this was, it's a myth, it's a story that was made up, to add details to it, to make it sound more exciting, just to bolster the Rabbanim's claim that, that their interpretation of religion is so much more correct than ours. Now, as a response to that is the golden era of Megillas Antiochos. The time that Megillas Antiochos was read the most, was lein the most, was dealt with the most, was during that time of the Karayim, as a response to the Karayim. Now, before I link it up with how it's actually a response to the Karayim and a little bit of what it says in Megillas Antiochos, let's just talk, background information, what Megillas Antiochos is. So Megillas Antiochos it's relatively short. It's probably maybe even a little shorter than the size of the Megillas Esther. Probably shorter, yeah. It's shorter than the Megillas Esther. It tells the story of Chanukah, some of the battles. Meaning, we know from the Gemara and Shabbos that the details that Chazal give about the battles that were involved in the Chanukah story are very, very few and far in between. Chazal do not spend a lot of time describing the battles that transpired, but in Megillas Antiochos it goes into a lot of these stories, a lot of the things that we know that we're taught as children, it goes into there in much more detail. Now, who wrote the Megillas Antiochos in the first place? So, the Rav Sadia Gaon, who was one of the primary fighters against the Karayim. Rav Sadia Gaon was a Gaon in the 900s, who was maybe the late 800s, 900s, who was one of the primary fighters against the Karayim movement, and who used Megillas Antiochos as a tool in his battle against the Karayim. So he wrote a mavoi to Megillas Antiochos in Arabic, and from there we have a lot of the information as to exactly how to look at Megillas Antiochos. So Rav Sadia Gaon, in his Hakdama, and this is translated into Hebrew, he writes that Ukamoisha Kasvu b'nei Chashmonai Yehuda v'Shimon v'Yochanan v'Yonasan v'Elazar b'nei Matasyo. He says all the 5 children of Matasyo, Sefer b'Masha Avar Aleim Hadayim l'Sefer Daniel b'Lashin Kastim. He says there's a Sefer that was written by the 5 sons of Matasyo, Yehuda, Shimon, Yochanan, Yonasan, and Elazar, the 5 children, and they wrote a Sefer similar to Lashon of Daniel, which is written in an Aramaic and a type of non-Hebraic tongue, which was what the language they obviously spoke at the time, and they wrote this Megillas Antiochos to tell over the story for Klal Yisrael for the future Deiros. Now there are other sources in the Rishonim that are mashma that the Ziknei Talmidei Shammai v'Hillel, are the ones who wrote down this story of Megillas Antiochos. But be it as it may, everyone who's presenting the Megillas Antiochos is clearly stating that it's a very ancient book. Megillas Antiochos is either from the children of Chashmonaim or from the Ziknei Shammai V'Hillel, but b'chol they wrote down this story at the time to be maskir, these nisim, and over time, as Klal Yisrael stopped speaking, the language of Aramaic or whatever this language is that's written, that Daniel's written in, that Megillas Antiochos was originally written in. So less and less people were able to connect with this Maisa and to read this Megillas Antiochos and to understand it. So into that diminishing interest is where Saadia Gaon steps in, and amongst his, included in his translations of the Torah into Arabic, he also translates Megillas Antiochos into Arabic, and I'll read a little bit from his Akdama. He writes as follows. He says, Amar Saadia ben Yosef, Rosh de Mesifta. Achshav ani l'nacha and l'hoisif l'sipur. I think it's important to be Moisef and tell over the story. Gama shakar l'bnei Yisrael. Also, what happened to Klal Yisrael was man ha'yevanim. Kisha-Leviim lakchu al atzmam, when the Leviim took it upon themselves, l'hishia as ha'am, to save Klal Yisrael mehatzaras shenaflu aleim, from the tzaras that befell them. Hatam shani misametz liyaset tzipur zeh. The reason, he says, and this is the kicker, this is the punchline, he says, the reason why I'm seeking to reinstate this story, because there are people today, he says, and in this he's referring to the Karaim, who are openly challenging and denying that the story ever happened. This caused me to write down the story to establish the story with great truth, to slug up this that the Makrishim are trying to say that the story never happened. And then he translates the entire story into Arabic so that it's easy for everybody to read it. And then the story begins. The Megillas Antiochos starts to take on a real popularity. Rabbeinu Nissin in the Hakdama to his sefer called Chibur Yafar Mitashua. His sefer is called Yafar Mitashua. Today Zechron Aaron publishes it in the back of one of the Midrashim. But in Chibur in Yafar Mitashua from Rabbeinu Nissim, he writes clearly that I'm going to say over different stories, different mifsim that happened to Klal Yisrael throughout the Deiros, not including the famous ones like Megillas Esther and Megillas Bnei Chashmonaim and V'shar HaMuris like Klulim B'chafta Al Tzvarim. He says, I'm going to leave out the ones that everybody knows. So you see the Rabbeinu Nissim, who didn't follow too long after Saadia Gaon, by his period already, he's writing that this is Bakan Tazach, and everybody knows now these Nisim and these Mifsim. There are rayas from Tosfos in a few different places that Tosfos clearly knew the exact nusach from the Megillah from the Megillas Antiochos. Now, even more so than just that it was known and that it was something that people said, that people were aware of, and that everyone understood the story, there also seems to have been a minig to read it in shul. Now, it's hard to know exactly which kehilas had the minig to read it in shul or which ones didn't, and at what point those minhagim, started and went away. A lot of the detail on this is missing, but we do have that the Taisis Rid in Sukkah and Daf Mem Daled, Taisis Rid in the middle of a different discussion of it, Taisis Rid says, V'chein nami makim, shenoyeg and likra Megillas Antiochos b'Chanukah, ein roya levarach aleh, pnei she'ein sheirish chiyav klal. Says the Taisis Rid, in places where they're noyeg to read the Megillas Antiochos, you shouldn't make a bracha because there's no sheirish for the chiyav. So now, the Taisis Rid is you could look at this two ways. The Taisis Rid is yes, cutting it down to size. That reading the Megillas Antiochos in shul is not the same as reading the Megillas Esther. It's not the same as Kriyas HaTorah, as a Haftarah. It's not on Yena's same high Ramah as other Kriyas that we do in shul. But B, you see clearly from the Taisis Rid, is Rishai the Trani, who's writing from Italy, that the minig is, or was, Al Kapanim in places that he was aware of, to read from the Megillas Antiochos in shul, in public, at some point, where Al Kapanim, the Shaila would have arisen, that maybe there should be a bracha to make on reading the Megillas Antiochos as well. There's some other, Minhagim Svarim that bring it. That seems that there was definitely Kehilas that read from Megillas Antiochos in shul. Now, another nekuda of the Megillas Antiochos that makes it, something different, meaning Hagam, it's not the status of a Megillah, but something that makes it, somewhat elevated and somewhat distinct, is as follows. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Mishnah in Sanhedrin in Parek Chelik, in the beginning, when it lists all the people who are Ein Lem Chelik Leilam Haba. So the Gemara brings that Rabbi Akiva was Meisif. Rabbi Akiva says, Afa Kair B'Svarim Achitzainim. Also someone who reads from the external Svarim. Now, this is worthy of going into on its own one day, and in Mitzvah one day we'll do a piece on Svarim Chitzainim It's a topic worthy of its own. What exactly is included? What the parameters of that Isser is? If this is still exists, still applies? It needs to be talked about. But the short shrift of it is that Svarim Chitzainim means any sefer that's dated from very old, dated to a similar time from the Sifrei Tanakh, but yet is not from Nevuah and is not included in the Sifrei Tanakh. So to read from those Svarim is very problematic. Either because it weakens the Mesorah, the chain of Mesorah that we include from the Svarim that we include, or something more nefarious than that. Maybe there's things in there that are problematic. But Shia, we'll save that for a different day. Rabbi Akiva clearly says in the Gemara in Sanhedrin that Hakar b'Svarim Chitzainim, a very strong davar chamer ein lechelik olam haba. Now, some of the books that have a lot of the details about the Chanukah story is a sefer called Sefer Maccabim. I think there's Sefer Maccabim 1, 2, and 3, maybe even 4 versions of Sefer Maccabim, and each one of them has different details of the story. And many of the Gedolei Achronim, I shouldn't say many, some of the Achronim, write. For example, the Maratzchias in his Sefer Teres Neviim, the Maratzchias writes that when Chazal, he says, we're doiche svarim chitzainim, he says, shemechlalam sifrei achashmeinoim b'shtei yadayim. He says, Chazal, when they would doiche the svarim chitzainim, they would doiche them b'shtei yadayim, and they included the sifrei achashmeinoim, the hainu, the Sefer HaMakkabim. Ki em noigdim lekabbalas ha-Mesorah b'yadeinu midar dar. It's something that, it doesn't go with the Mesorah that we have. It uproots the Mesorah that Klal Yisrael has. The Tzemach David, who's I think a Talmud of the Ramah, one of the earliest Jewish historians, not the most reliable Jewish historian in the world, but one of the earliest Jewish historians, the Tzemach David, he writes, as well, the same thing, that Svarim Chitzainim ubechlalam Sefer HaChashmonaim is mekubalim lenoitzrim v'loy lanu. These are Svarim that are acceptable, that are accepted by Catholics, they're not accepted by our circles. So meaning to say that a lot of the Svarim, Sefer HaMakkabim, that have the details that would be applicable to the story of Chanukah would be unacceptable to pursue and to peruse in an official capacity. Meaning, maybe if when we get to this, we'll discuss, according to many poskim, to look in one of these svarim for to look something up or for a short time might not be aser, but to peruse them and to go through them in a very serious fashion, according to the Gemara, is probably an iser chamer ad ma'od, and according to the Maratzchias and other achronim, it's included clearly. So the source that is left available, that was a good source for Haredi and for rabbinic Jews who wanted to know more about the story about Chanukah and wanted to internalize those messages, was the Megillas Antiochos. So now, to summarize, the Megillas Antiochos certainly was old. It exists, from a very long time ago. It was written in a language that was cumbersome, that was hard to use, and therefore, at a certain point, its popularity began to wane. When Klal Yisrael was under attack from people who said that our Mesiras Nefesh and our commitment to what's important to us was just the narrative that was crafted, that was made up, Rav Sadi Gaon and the other Gaonim from his Tkufa took a special liking to the story of Chanukah and to the Megillas Antiochos that describes the story of Chanukah as a way of bolstering Klal Yisrael's commitment and emunah to fighting for what's worth it. Meaning, so I would say is as follows: although today the actual minig of reading from Megillas Antiochos in any capacity, be it public, be it private, be it one-on-one, has certainly faded into obscurity, and Kamat, nobody is doing it anymore. But overall, I would say confidently that Rav Sadi Gaon, he certainly won the battle. Where Rav Sadi Gaon was looking to transmit to Klal Yisrael with Megillas Antiochos was to give that national story of Mesiras Nefesh that we all share, meaning a bonding story that shows that Klal Yisrael for always was willing to fight and willing to really push for the things that were important to us. And mainly that gives us purpose and mission in everything that faces us, in these dairas. So I would say certainly Rav Sadi Gaon, although the actual minig of reading from the Megillas Antiochos, be it in Arabic or Aramaic or Hebrew or whatever language you'll find it in, is something that is not so popular today anymore. But the neshama of the takana of reading from Megillas Antiochos to imbue Klal Yisrael with a spirit of Mesiras Nefesh was certainly something that Rav Sadi Gaon was very matzliach in. A freilich in Chanukah.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.